Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from Patricia Taxxon, Sapphire Apts. Or Sapphire Apartments, but she said it Apts, so yeah, I'm going with that. Alright, I've talked about Patricia Taxxon more than a few times before on this channel. I have a playlist of my 6 previous videos on her in the description for those interested in exploring her long-running history. Last time I covered her was through her Das Triadische Ballett project, a set of 3 thematically interconnected albums that were all 8 out of 10 material individually, but when treated as a singular package, had enough combined substance and replay value to eventually end up becoming my favorite project to come out of 2020 overall. Unquestionably the most impressed I've been with any project she put out up to that point. Now, the months since that project dropped have actually been surprisingly slow by her standards. I mean, in between the release of Triadische Ballett at the end of last June and this latest album, which dropped on New Year's Eve, she's only put out 3 other projects. 2 EPs and 1 album, which, while clearly not low effort by any metric, was still relatively short. In October, we got Soul Waste, her first real video game soundtrack, set to this PS1-style platformer, which was part of an indie game compilation called Dread X Collection 3. Did not play the game myself, but the soundtrack certainly seemed to fit the theme pretty well and was enjoyable enough even out of context. In November, we got her Heaven Sun EP, which was apparently predictive of this trend that's popped up very recently called Hex D, which I guess is this mix of like cloud rap and trap instrumentals with a lot of super abrasive bit crushed sounds. The EP was fine, if not really my cup of tea. It was a bit headache-inducing more than anything, but if that's your aesthetic of choice, it'll probably do you well. Certainly impressive production work to be able to fit so many sounds in the mix as effectively as she did. But speaking of abrasive and dense, we also got her direct attempt at making a hyperpop album with Fresh Tapes 2 in early December. I'll freely admit that I am not much of a hyperpop guy myself either. See my previously held thoughts on Sophie or that last Arca album. All tends to be a bit much for my tastes. And I won't act like this wasn't also a bit much for me, to say the least. But I did actually have more fun with it than I expected to. Patricia's typical production style is a pretty good match for this genre, and even ends up with something better produced than most other stuff I've heard in this style. And the guest features were all really well implemented. The track with Backwash was really something else, and not even necessarily the best part of the album. Don't see myself hanging on to it longer term, but if you are a fan of that genre, then it's definitely worth your time. But that brings us to this most recent project, Sapphire Apts. She'd been advertising this as her attempt to do something in a mainstream pop sort of vein. And on the same day that she released this, she also put out a video essay exploring, like, music theory and putting together 4-chord loops, which I would definitely recommend watching. I'll have that linked in the description as well. I know for a fact she's really proud of her work on this one. Even right on first listen, I could tell it was definitely among her highest effort projects to date. That said, on that first listen the day it came out, I was initially pretty thrown off and was wondering to myself, wait, wasn't this supposed to be like a mainstream pop album? That didn't sound like I expected it to. There are definitely a handful of tracks in the second half of the project that sound like they could be viable in the mainstream pop landscape, but nothing that preceded the track You're Welcome sounded particularly mainstream to me at all. Doesn't mean I wasn't still into it, mind you. A lot of the material in the first half of the project sounded to me like it was continuing exploration into the music theory and compositional side of things, as seen on, say, her Rosa album, and I still thought it was all solid for what it was. That did lead to this album feeling kinda disjointed, though. I feel like I have pretty solidly formed thoughts on each individual track here, but my mind feels like it's being shot off in a different direction with each passing track, and I'm not sure how well it really comes together as a complete whole. I mean, it's the kind of album that needed a proper video for me to explain my thoughts on, basically. Though there isn't anything here I outright dislike or don't at least think is pretty good, so, don't worry about that. So this album starts out in some very low-key territory with 2 relatively simple near-ambient instrumental cuts. We got Wind and Winding, which is a plinky synth doodle that seems to have some strong modern classical influence in its arrangements, also aided by the fact that it's a duet with violinist Bojan Sisik. Sorry for butchered pronunciation as per usual. His performance going over really well with her usual synth plucking and hitting on a solid, heartfelt emotional note. Fun fact, I've been told that said violinist discovered Patricia's music directly through my review of Triadische Ballett. The two of them apparently really hit it off, and he appears a second time later on this album, so that's pretty cool. The other ambient-ish instrumental, Dandelion, is also nice, has a cool 9/4 time signature and some enjoyably sleepy synth tones, though it didn't stick out to me as much as the opener. But then we got The Horse, which I'm of two minds of. In one breath, it's a lot of fun to listen to and is the kind of cool creative move that only Patricia Taxxon would do. This super unstable and unhinged sounding banging instrumental, made so unstable purely by its strange dissonant chord progressions that sound like they're tumbling over each other, and bright melodies that sound borderline inebriated, going over lots of sharp metallic percussion. It's a lot of fun, but at the same time, this track doesn't feel like it has any business being on this particular album. It's way too dissonant and weird sounding to make sense appearing on a supposed mainstream pop album. It feels really out of place here. This was the point at which I was the most intensely confused about this album's advertised musical direction when I first heard it. Because, I was 3 tracks in and I was not hearing anything even remotely resembling pop yet. Though this track is also the only one that actually sounds like that. The album does in fact get progressively poppier the further you get into it. Vinhos mostly sounds like a glitchy ambient IDM-esque piece to me with its melancholy pads and skittering percussion, but the kicks and snares do have that typical reggaeton rhythm, and you got the auto-tune vocals from Luz Kaplan here as well that do make this track feel marginally poppier than the stuff that came before it. Very nice stuff all around, really like that one. And then we get Kanban, which does go on for 7 minutes, and I really wanted to say I like more than I actually do. It's still a solid track, Patricia giving a typically solid vocal performance, and those plinky drop sections are plenty of fun, but I don't know, I kept getting a somewhat irritating sense of deja vu out of this one, thanks to a few different melodic elements, like those higher-pitched keyboard melodies in the very beginning make me feel like I've heard her use them somewhere else before, or maybe they just kind of sound like lower-key Alice DJ, I don't know. And the actual lead melody that she's singing, I was able to pin down a lot faster, but how it sounds almost exactly like the lead melody of the second half of her old track 9 Stars from Pix and Bits. My mind went there immediately and it just got stuck there. And that did become a problem since I do not think this track is better than 9 Stars. Again, still nice stuff, I mean, those elements did mildly bug me. But this album does pick up a lot more in the second half. We then get to You're Welcome. This was the first track where I was like, oh, there's the mainstream pop. She originally wrote it as sort of a parallel to Ariana Grande's Thank You Next. See the video essay I mentioned for her insight on how that came together. And she did in fact manage to pull off the same general vibe as that track with its low-key synth progressions and trap beat. And I think I might actually prefer this track a tiny bit. I mean, I'll admit, Thank You Next is not one of my personal favorite Ariana Grande tracks, so that's not as huge a compliment as it might be coming from someone else. And the guest singer Lou, she's not as impressive a vocalist as Ariana, if I do have to make that comparison, but she certainly does very well here. She hits some really high notes after this one key change near the end. Maybe sounds like she's straining a little bit in that part, but she still hits the notes. But the cherry on top for this one is the addition of the strings from Bojan Sisik again, as well as Imogen Seth Smith. They were the elements that really took this track to another level for me and made it stand out, as well as the bass lines from Adam Neely. Yes, that Adam Neely. He may mostly stay in the background, but he does a cool little solo at the very end that I liked. And his presence is welcome throughout the track. Maybe very simple sounding and stripped back, but I think this one actually stood out to me as my personal favorite in the bunch, especially thanks to that outro. And this does feel like the track where Patricia most effectively nailed the mainstream pop vibe that she was advertising this album to have. And this track transitions pretty cleanly into another instrumental, The Panther, which seems to continue the same sort of low-key vibe that You're Welcome created and directly flow out of it, with more organ-like synth timbres going over the trap beat and even a pretty awesome saxophone performance from Taylor Avella, because why not? Also very nice stuff. That one didn't stick out at first, but it was definitely a big grower for me. And from there we get even poppier with Loving Was, instrumentally as the same sort of low-key trap synth instrumentals, but Emad Elaiden, their vocals are much more extroverted and impassioned than Lou's or Patricia's, and elevates this track in a totally different way that reminds me a lot of those trap-focused cuts on Come and Have a Go's Heart Failure, like Rains or Angel. I bet a collab between them and Patricia could go over well. And after a fairly enjoyable, if not particularly noteworthy instrumental in Boom, that also sort of flows out of the previous track, it's nice but kind of forgettable, then we get to Our Axis, which aims to be like this big 2013 style EDM banger, which he has obviously had a much more successful track record for pulling off really well. And of course, this bangs exactly as much as you'd expect and want it to. Trevor Lake also really got into his vocal performance and killed it. This was another big favorite on the album. And then finally we get to the closer, which is a cover of Owl City's Fireflies. Which, it sounds exactly what you would expect Patricia Taxxon covering Fireflies would sound like. It's not really like this fresh or creative alternate take on the track. It just sounds like the original, but with Patricia's usual synth tones and vocals. But, I mean, this track's influence has also sort of loomed over much of her back catalog as well. I myself will admit I have a hard time taking the original seriously thanks to a YTP an old colleague of mine made of the track years ago, and I never had that strong a personal connection to the original to begin with, so I won't act like this was one of my big favorites, but I do think she did the track justice, and it did make for a solid way to close this project out. And yeah, that's everything on Sapphire Apts. There's nothing on this project I did not like. When the lowest points on here are a mildly forgettable instrumental like Boom, or a track like Kanban whose biggest crime is sounding a little rehashy, and there are as many high points as there are, that's only a good sign. This has all the ingredients for an album that could hit 8 out of 10 level for me, and on a few listens it did actually get there. But, I don't know, something about this project did kind of feel amiss the more I listened to it. And I think it's just that these tracks don't always feel like they belong together or coalesce together into a greater whole as well as they could. It takes a weirdly long time for this project to actually deliver on the kind of mainstream pop material she was advertising, and ends up feeling like kind of a half-formed experiment, which is not actually a common problem for Patricia Taxxon albums. 90% of her other projects she has no problem coming up with like a cohesive vision and sticking to it the whole way through. This was oddly scattershot as a complete whole, but, you know, it's still plenty of fun to listen to. And I can definitely still give it my recommendation. While it's not one of her more consistent efforts, the best moments do stand out among some of her best work to date. All the collaborations here went over fantastically well too, and even in its lower points, this is clearly a project that she put a ton of effort into, and it does show the whole time. So yeah, make sure you give this a shot if it's passed you by. Maybe just short of greatness for me, but it's one of her upper tier projects for sure. I'm overall feeling a very strong 7.7 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.